Welcome to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and specialty insurance markets meet. You're listening to a new special episode in association with Gallagher Specialty. Our theme is timely, given ongoing events in the Gulf, choke points and geopolitical risk, resilience building for supply chains in crisis. I'm your host, David Benyon, and I'm joined by two wonderful guests from Gallagher. Alec Russell is Managing Director, Cargo for Arthur J Gallagher International, and Alex Weil is an Associate Consultant for Threat Intelligence at AnotherDay, a Gallagher company. Nearly 9 in 10 businesses experienced a supply chain loss during the past year, according to Gallagher research, and that was before the current crisis in the Strait of Hormuz began to affect global supply chains. Supply chain geopolitical risks, as well as tariffs and trade disputes, were already cited as the top reasons for trade disruptions getting worse. In this episode, two specialists within crisis management and marine cargo insurance broking explain how organisations are responding to supply chain risk in theory and practice. We begin with some live crisis framing and immediate impact on the ongoing situation in the Strait of Hormuz. Then we get to know the guests a little better, their roles and responsibilities. Next, we talk about the structural fragilities of supply chains before looking ahead to future threat scenarios and the role of intelligence. Just for clarity, obviously we have an Alec and an Alex on this episode. So for the avoidance of doubt, Alec addresses the first question first, providing his cargo broker point of view, followed by Alex adding his crisis consulting perspective. Okay then, that's plenty from me. Let's get into it. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Alec, let's start with you. So we're recording this in the middle of a live geopolitical crisis in the Gulf, which is affecting supply chains globally. Was the current crisis on the risk radar for clients, do you think? And obviously there's some research that Gallagher has done in this respect. So did they have some options in place to boost their resilience? Or are we still in a phase where everyone's reacting initially?
This is something that we talked about with clients for many years prior to this event, and even at the end of 2025, it's an impact from Israel as well. Kind of, again, that raised the profile of Iran and its proximity to the energy resources within the Gulf. So clients knew it was there. They did what they could to risk manage that. But because of the structure and the geography of that part of the world and just how much kind of flows in and out on vessels in the Strait and traded throughout the Persian Gulf, I think clients just went, there isn't a real alternative. And certainly with the volume that you were looking at. So for example, if you looked at kind of the emergency measures that are in place now, such as the oil pipeline from Ras Tanura over to the western side of Saudi Arabia, the Saudis weren't looking at that as a viable option in terms of risk management, in terms of getting oil out of Eastern Province and to the rest of the world. They are now, and there's very much a big, as you said, a big reaction, and we're still in that phase. We're coming to the end of that phase, I would say, of kind of everyone just, they've had the shock, they've reacted to the shock, and now we're probably just starting to move to that phase where everyone has changed their supply chain. So if they're shipping into different parts of the Arabian Peninsula, they're using trucks, they're using pipelines, they're using various different measures to move their goods from A to B. And I think the next stage you'll see, certainly in the short term, people will start seeing opportunity there. So you'll start seeing people going, well, you know, if I do now have a fleet of trucks, I can help you move your goods and using that. As I said, that's probably the next phase. And we're probably on the cusp between those two.
Yeah. The geo in geopolitics places some pretty hard constraints on people's options. And as you say, it will take time to develop some of those. So Alex, let's turn to you then. So from a threat intelligence or crisis consulting perspective, what have some clients been asking you in the early days of the crisis? And how did those priorities evolve as events are still unfolding?
So quite similar to Alec, actually, we had been producing off the back of the mid-2025 a sort of scenario planning report for any Iranian escalation. And this had been something that we'd done just off the back of the initial sort of limited tit-for-tat strikes. So as the current phase of the conflict picked up, luckily we had that resource to move forward with. Obviously, as it then escalated further, we were able to kind of do our own sort of yardstick from that. But from the client side, initially, as many people, it was very reactive. It was, this is happening right at this moment. What sort of advice do you give to us? What are the indicators that it's going to escalate, and in what different regions? Because naturally, many of our clients don't have a footprint in one Gulf country or in one country in the Middle East. They will have a footprint across a number of different states and nations. And that obviously comes with a host of different challenges and understanding of local risk profiles, which we had to assume and then also understand for the client. We then also helped sort of our crisis consulting from a threat intelligence perspective in providing the intel towards sort of extraction. So this could be of C-suite individuals or anyone that was sort of coming to AnotherDay or Gallagher's some form of crisis consulting. And this was happening very early on when, Bahrain had shut their airspace, Qatar had shut their airspace for a period, even the UAE. So then it was identifying other exfil routes, be it through Saudi or for Oman initially as well. And then moving on to that, as the conflict began to sort of change shape, it was then clients were coming to us and asking, understanding the intended targeting from the IRGC or the Iranian state, what industries were going to be specifically targeted next. And this was helping them see through sort of the noise that was coming from either Telegram or from Twitter or X or any sort of profiles based in Iran or affiliated with, because they're pumping out, numerous different lists of alerts. We're going to strike X industry or this industry. So it then very much moved to that where we were helping clients delve into that and understand, has that increased the threat profile? Are they then in a country where that industry is going to be targeted? Are they near a US installation? Or are they in a key industry which is seen as part of the tit-for-tat strikes, energy, desalination plants?
There's a key distinction, I think, between marine and non-marine risk for insurers, especially where traditional cargo cover starts and stops. So how are clients responding to that gap? And are there some interesting dynamics that you'd want to pick up emerging in relation to it and managing supply chains?
What you've seen in the last 2 months or so is where traditional war cover stops once goods arrive onto land. You've ended up with clients suddenly going, I still want to insure these goods. And so having to react and suddenly kind of go out into the market to purchase those covers in a very short space of time. Now, very fortunately, of where we sit, within the Lloyd's and the London market, those coverages were available. Underwriters didn't put their pens down, they were still giving that cover. And we're very fortunate to some of our insurer partners for enabling us to offer those to our clients. These were coverages that aren't traditionally bought or weren't traditionally purchased. They were never kind of mandated by lenders or by banks, for example. So I think Assured suddenly looked at the exposure that they had and went, look, we do still want to make sure we've got cover for those goods, whether they're in store at a port location or whether they're in a warehouse or whether they are then transiting on land. And that's still happening. So that hasn't changed. That's still going on today. What we're now seeing is a change in where those exposures are. So as clients look to kind of de-risk from the most exposed areas, they're then trying to still move their goods, but in slightly reduced exposed areas, such as up around the Red Sea, into Jordan, into the northern ports or the northwestern ports of Saudi Arabia, and then trucking across the Arabian Peninsula. It's a very dynamic situation still. When you've got X amount of barrels onto a vessel, 1 minute you could price something out at, say, $100, $110 a barrel. When that actually comes to landing and executing the order, that pricing has changed, which means that we've had to go out into the market and purchase extra limit for clients, extra cover that they haven't had. And we've had to do that in a very short space of time. So our team have done a fantastic job of making sure our clients are getting the service that they need. And as I said, that the market is still there and available and offering those coverages. But there's many different factors that make up the pricing, especially when you're looking at kind of bulk oil shipments. And so we are seeing those pricings change very quickly and often at the last minute. There's many, many different people to transit through the kind of war zone at the moment. There's many, many different people involved. It's not just the cargo owner, it's the ship owner, it's the people on the vessel themselves. And all of those different stakeholders need to be comfortable with the risks associated before the decision is made to transit in and around that part of the world at the moment. So hence why, as I said, often at the last minute, it's then, right, we're going, but we need another 10 million, we need another 20 million, we need another 100 million. Yeah, it's very sudden.
I gave a very basic introduction to you both at the start of this episode. So a question to both of you. Would you each just please give a brief explainer of what your role means and the team's responsibilities and how you came to make this your area of subject matter expertise?
I'm an associate consultant in the threat intelligence team for AnotherDay, predominantly focusing on our direct clients. So those that we've had sort of on our books quite a while now, and dealing mainly in sort of threat prevention. So this could be on the physical side. So that could be executive protection. So helping C-suite understand the threats both to them, but then also sort of their weak points via online or in the physical as well. But then also that's geolocated site security. So understanding the threat environment surrounding client sites, manufacturing sites, offices. And this again varies very drastically depending on jurisdiction. It could be war threats, it could be terrorism threats, but then in the US or other regions, it could then be active shooter threats as well. And then finally, we also do a lot of due diligence work. So this will be, acquiring new assets in high-risk jurisdictions, understanding what political affiliation, are there politically exposed persons working in the company? But then also, are there any individuals who may have gone under the radar when it came to legal searches? And, just enabling clients to have a final understanding alongside their compliance teams of who they're either working with or looking to acquire. And our sort of threat prevention works both, as I've already said, on the physical side, but then there's also that reputational risk monitoring that we quite often do as well, which, as we all know, is now a key part of understanding what a company's threat profile looks like, because online scandals can equate to just as much damage as any physical scandals or any physical threats. And they often marry quite badly together, where, a online scandal can then escalate into on-the-ground situation, protesting, for instance. So we quite often find that the work we're doing is very interlinked. So I studied history at university, predominantly Middle Eastern history, and had previously interned at AnotherDay over a number of periods whilst at university. Been at the company now for 7 months. And it's a very specialized industry, so it's great to break into and sort of use the expertise that you gather from either experience previous or in education. But yeah, thoroughly enjoying it, and also very topical and quite busy.
I lead our marine cargo and stock throughput business here in London. So we're a team of 30 placing business and marine cargo business for global clients. So essentially, if you're moving goods from A to B, whether that's moving or whether it's in store, that's what we cover. And it's kind of everything that you wear, use, need to propel your car, your plane, anything of that nature. So right down from mobile phones to clothes to grain to food to laptops. And as I said, it's a very large kind of bulk commodities such as fertilizer, oil, petrochemicals, etc., etc. So that's what I do. I have been doing this now for 17 years. I kind of fell into insurance.
No, you're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to say.
I'm very, very pleased that I did. Yeah, I actually read history as well. And
We're a bit of biased.
Bias, exactly. I was a sailor. So I was like, right, it's got to be marine insurance. There's too many times that I'd seen the vessels in the Solent and probably sailed in front of them a little bit too close whilst racing to be like, look, if silly people like me are out there, then they need protecting. So so that's where it started. The more I got into it, the more it's fascinating. And every day has been different in 17 years because interests are always different. The risks facing an oil client are similar yet very different to someone that's shipping fresh produce, fresh meat, or even grains or anything.
The current crisis situation we have in the Middle East, is this the kind of most, in your career so far, the time when your job role is really in the thick of it than ever before?
I felt the first kind of 12 years of my career, cargo insurance was I used to call it the ugly stepsister of insurance, right? They're a character in the story, but no one really knows what happens to them. They're a little bit of an afterthought. And the last 5 years, that has completely flipped the other way. And there are many examples of that. Geopolitical events have been a massive part of what we've done in the last 5 years. Russia-Ukraine war as well has been a massive part of that. It started with COVID. Everyone needed to move COVID jabs from left, right. And we were getting phone calls saying that we've got $100 million worth of COVID jabs sat on the tarmac. They won't let us fly them without insurance. Yeah, and it was those kind of moments when we all sat at home that really brought what we did, like providing that insurance to companies and transferring that risk of loss from their balance sheet onto insurers' balance sheets that, as I said, put us on the front pages. So the last 5 years have been very, very interesting.
So just as a logical extension to that then, what are the products and services that you're both providing, each of you, to help manage clients' urgent supply chain risk challenges?
The biggest thing we provide physical loss or damage to the goods as they move from A to B, anywhere in the world. That's cargo insurance 101. But what we give to clients is a little bit more than that, because we are sat here, and this is where Alex and his team come in very, very handy in terms of providing that advice to clients on the threats they're facing and the exposure that they have to make sure they're managing their risk as best as possible. None of our clients want to see their goods getting lost or destroyed because they're fulfilling orders. That's the lifeblood of the businesses that they run. And so on top of that, when those losses do happen, that's again where we're there to make sure that those goods are returned. From a monetary perspective, we enable clients to continue trading. We get their money back as quickly as we possibly can. And we're also able to kind of react to when their supply chains do need to change and making sure they're getting that cover at all times. In terms of coverages that we provide, it's not just the physical loss damage to the goods. From a cargo perspective, within Gallagher, we provide political violence, trade disruption, and we're also looking at kind of newer areas that have been created as a result of this crisis.
AnotherDay is a Gallagher company. So whilst I predominantly deal with our direct clients' needs, obviously the given scenario at the moment in Iran, we've done a lot of work for Gallagher clients and also brokers on this sort of more insurance side. And that's kind of taken the form of a sit rep that we've been producing alongside obviously more ad hoc sort of requests. But we were sort of producing at the start, it was basically every day as the conflict was in its early sort of ebbs and flows, but then that sort of moved into more of a reporting period. So like twice a week. And that's been sent out to both our directs, but then also to Gallagher brokers to basically provide to theirs. And it's just providing that extra level of information. It's very hard to get consumed sometimes by the amount of information from news sources. So it's cutting into understanding the events of the past 3 days slightly more granularly. But then also in the sit rep within it, there's information on damages and impacts to infrastructure, be it air, ships, and then also on land as well, so land borders. And we've found from feedback that that's been, one of the most key parts of our services provided, because at times clients have said, actually, aside from some of that information or some of the discussions we've had, there's been a sense of limbo in some cases, especially in the early stages where there was a lot of disinformation going around. And I've mentioned it previously as well. Scenario planning is a very important part of our services, particularly with directs. And that is sort of almost wargaming, for want of a better word, an understanding of, okay, these are the different scenario indicators and they're the levels of risk. And when that indicator is met, that's the level you're currently at. And then it's, continuously moving forwards in different indicators. Now, all of those indicators don't have to be met. Sometimes they're not met, but sometimes they skip an indicator. But as long as a client has that in place, they then have an actionable list of things that they need to then do for both their employees, but then also for their services in the region, be it using different transit routes for their goods, that they now understand equates to that level of conflict and intensity. And then also we're at the service of our clients for eminent requests as well. So these are more boutique requests, understanding of they perhaps received intel from a different source that, as I said earlier, their particular industry is going to be targeted. We then break that down and, look at it from an Iranian perspective, understand what the threat messaging has been like in that region with regards to US or European industry, and then respond to that in a timely manner and help them understand that whilst it's reactive, you always have to have a lens of moving forwards as well. So helping them understand this may not be correct, but in the future, you will see posting coming from IRGC affiliated telegrams or news outlets. And this is how you understand this data better.
Let's take a step back from the current crisis. Thinking about the structural fragility of supply chains, obviously can't avoid referring to current events, but why are modern supply chains so inherently fragile and exposed to disruption?
off the back of sort of 21st century, late 20th century globalization, I think we soon found that supply chains, whilst locationally diverse, quite often are quite closely politically linked. I mean, I know we said we're not going to take the most recent example, but if we take the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, now they are locationally diverse from each other, albeit in the same region. But ultimately, the actors that are acting in and around that region, the Houthis, piracy off the coast of Somalia, and then Iranian actors in the Strait of Hormuz, they are ultimately politically linked to each other, albeit through a wider web of networks. But then taking a different example, the Black Sea and the Bosphorus is then also linked to more of the Arctic channels in the north as well when it comes to trade, because you have both European efforts to stop Russian shadow fleets. Then also in the south, you then have issues between Turkey, Ukraine, and Russia over the transiting of either military vessels or goods that are supposedly sanctioned. So I think that's the issue, that when analysts or brokers or the markets look at these supply routes, they may be very spread out geographically, and culturally they may be very different as well. And I'm sure we'll move on to it over sort of the fractures of global order and whatnot. Political alliances now are very dotted around. So political pressure may be placed onto a different strait or a different supply chain route because an ally thousands of kilometers away have an issue with a more local regional adversary.
We've seen examples of this that are not geopolitical. We've seen disruption in the Panama Canal, and it's not that long ago we saw disruption in the Suez Canal. And immediately it has a consequence on the other side of the globe.
I think the other major thing is how technology has changed. If you look at a mobile phone nowadays, the number of parts into that is massive. And you take that and people expect things like that now in their car, on their television, in their radio. And those goods have to come from somewhere. The precious metals, for example, that go into a mobile phone, or any of those technologies I just mentioned, they have to come from certain places. And those certain places in the world, the infrastructure in which they're mined from can be very difficult. And I think that because of that, and because of the number of items that go into making anything now, the supply chains have just become so complex, which means that there are so many different ways that you could impact them. And they're not always just a kind of geopolitical thing. You've got weather-related items. You've got many other different examples, fire at ports, strikes, regional or localized problems as well. And I think people talk about the impact that chips, not having enough computer chips, that impacts the automotive industry, that impacts technologies. It's just, as Alex said, the changing of globalization has made these supply chains just very vulnerable.
There's been talk about, a shift from just in time to just in case. That's not new. But is that a strategic change you've witnessed already? But it isn't always possible, is it? We already talked about the geographic constraints sometimes, the geo and geopolitics as well. Are we seeing more reactive behaviors rather than strategic change? Like stockpiling, for example, more of a reaction than an actual strategy. And again, it's not just the current situation, is it? It's tariffs or sanctions, other sort of choke point related shortages.
We saw a large amount of stockpiling as a result of the tariff situation. People trying to bring the goods in the past year or 18 months, like bringing goods into North America to de-risk from the impact of tariffs onto their business, which obviously just meant you then had a large amount of items in one place, a large amount of accumulation. Obviously, again, for us on the insurance side, we need to make sure that those are insured adequately and appropriately. And I think these changes are always happening and they're going to continue to happen.
Alex, choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea before it, obviously not that long ago as the Houthis were the centre of attention and could yet be again. These have dominated headlines. How much of the risk sits beyond those flashpoints? For example, infrastructure weaknesses or local security issues, ports, logistics.
Yeah, I think we kind of alluded to it a little bit about how localized security issues can be just as damaging than geopolitical issues. We've worked with clients and where port facilities, particularly in areas where the local security situation is quite complex or there is a vacuum in security personnel. Think, for instance, West Africa, a key export region for oil goods, petrochemical goods. Nigeria, in the port of Lagos, there is a number of ports there where they're surrounded by somewhat of a destabilized security situation when it comes to local authority. Now, this isn't geopolitical movements. This isn't, rebel groups or factional infighting. These are local banditry that are making use out of the destabilized nature of the security zone. And they're not massive steals. They're not taking serious amounts of export materials away from suppliers, but they're just degrading the security situation enough and making small-scale theft, where some larger multinationals begin to look at that region or look at a security situation and think, actually, A, what do we have to implement to put in, security barriers, or what do we need to essentially say to our local security personnel or any of our local regional personnel in the event of this happening, X, Y, and Z needs to be produced. But also, I think then the damage, not only from any physical potential damages, it is that essence, a reputational damage, whereby a client may then look to move elsewhere away from those port facilities, or, this is a global issue as well, not just in the particular region I mentioned. But I think that's an inherent risk to itself, because if the supply chain is disrupted in port, then those who are being supplied with any form of goods then begin to question, okay, what mitigation have you put in place where you then need to move to a different export terminal or to a different export region? And away from the geopolitical as well, you then have sort of regional politics as well. If we think of East Africa, where there's been lots of discussion over ports in Somaliland or in Somalia and how that sort of skirts around regional tensions, that is very different to a wider geopolitical sense. We're not talking about large blocks between NATO allies. We're not talking about a conflict wider between Russia and the US and Europe. We're talking about regional politics here, where that then impacts the way that clients have to understand what are the regional dynamics between using a port in Somalia, or where would Ethiopia then begin to use ports outside of Djibouti if anything was to happen in the region.
We often hear about reshoring, friendshoring, the idea of regional trade blocs. Are these structural changes or more temporary responses to geopolitical pressures?
I think I'm going to be annoying here and say, unfortunately, it's somewhat of a combination. And I'll explain why that's annoying, because I think the structural changes that we're talking about, the reason why they exist is because they become structurally significant and long-lasting. For instance, we've seen with US tariffs where a lot of Western companies now are looking to move manufacturing facilities into the US. Now, that could be seen as, a structurally significant and long-lasting move. We don't know in 5 years if then there's going to be a reversal. At the moment, we can't assume whether or not that will occur. But I think then also equitable with that, or, the same as, there's then constant geopolitical pressures. We've seen the recent issues with OPEC and the UAE, where those are long-standing geopolitical issues within the region between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Prime example is the recent issues in Yemen over the STC, the Southern Transitional Coalition, where they were essentially moved out of the way by Saudi forces prior to the conflict in Iran. Now, that would have been bubbling under the radar, but then has almost come to fruition through trade issues and through OPEC-related issues. So I think, yes, annoying to sort of stray the party line between the two.
No, I think that's our perspective of what we're seeing on the ground. That's exactly what is happening.
So let's talk about future threats and the role of intelligence. So, Alex, are we seeing a shift from crisis response towards more scenario planning? And what do you think good scenario planning looks like? And part of that, how far ahead can you realistically plan in this environment?
Yes, I think in answer to the first part of that question, I think we really are seeing sort of a transition towards scenario planning, because we've essentially had, and particularly in the marine or supply chain risk industry, we've seen, Russia, Ukraine, and then we've also now seen sort of the Iranian conflict, where chief security officers or security infrastructure in-house are almost sort of in the initial stages having to put out a large amount of fires. And these are multinationals, so, they will have regional security, but then they'll also be largely centered either in the US or in Western Europe. And we've been speaking to sort of CSOs and anyone in their sort of security suites. And it is that initial stage of, we have so many different fires to put out because it's across the Middle East where these issues happen. It's not just centered around one Gulf state or in Iran, for instance. So yes, there's definitely been a transition now where even from requests towards AnotherDay have been, okay, moving forwards, we really do appreciate the imminent response that you provided to us. But I think we're now going to really focus on, even if it's Iran, if it's China, Taiwan, if it's India and Pakistan, any of these regions that have flared up, previously, or, analysts always use, as examples, it's shoring up what are our security protocols when events happen. Because I'm sure they have existed prior and they often change drastically. But if they can build that up prior to any large event happening, it just provides that extra degree of safety, not only to individuals working for the company, reputationally as well, but it just ensures that when the actual event happens, global security heads then don't have to worry about, okay, what's our contact with our local security teams and have we provided them with a plan in place? And I think in answer to the second part of your question, I think, I've used the word quite often throughout this, and I apologize for using it again, but escalation indicators are still, from our side, seen as a key aspect of providing this sort of scenario-based analysis, because it's all well and good essentially laying out a number of scenarios for a client and saying, this could happen and this could happen. But that's no different than if you were just to sort of war game it yourselves or understand it through purely a historical based focus, history impacts the future and whatnot through history. Undergrad sat on this table. But I think scenario indicators provide that extra level of reasoning as to why a scenario happened. And it's not only the why, you then have the sort of the time-based element of it. So it's, what is the linear progression when this indicator is met? Then the next indicator is met. And it just provides a very granular, but then also, I suppose, objective and thought out way for security teams to understand it, as opposed to picking from various different scenarios that may or may not happen at different times.
Any business that takes these scenarios, however far-fetched, and has some kind of a plan in place around them, you can't deny that it impacts the business, but it's those that have that and they've pre-thought about it. They create those opportunities first, and they create those opportunities in front of their competitors. And every time there is an impact or there is an event that happens, it does create opportunities for others wherever in the world. So my advice and our advice to clients is pre-plan for these things, because you never know when it's going to happen. And if you've thought about it and you have a kind of the idea in place, you will get to those opportunities in front of your competitors.
We're staying with that point, really. How much does what we're seeing today, actual real world events, improve the industry's ability to model and stress test scenarios elsewhere, other future potential choke point crises? Already mentioned South China Sea, there are other ones.
Again, it's using historical events and learning from them. You can take real world examples and go, well, look, this person got impacted here. This is how we learn from them. So there should be a lot of transferable lessons. We do a lot of work with Alex and his team around looking at potential threats to business. And there's a lot of modeling that happens around the potential impacts that various businesses can face, but we don't often know what that severity will look like from those threats.
We're now seeing, and it's helping the industry actually to understand, what do the threats look like? As in, what do the actual physical threats look like towards shipping? And I'm talking here about, for instance, the usage of drones, targeting ships, but then also the ready ease with which the Houthis or Iran have targeted vessels with missiles launched, surface to ship missiles. And without, again, wanting to go down the historical analogy route, if we look back to previous events where global commerce has been disrupted, even, for instance, World War II, what lessons would they have learned towards blockading from World War I? And if we move forward to the present day, we've had very good examples, both in the Russia-Ukraine war and then also in the most recent Iran conflict, where we can combine the learnings. You don't have to be in the military to combine the learnings that everyone's acquired from understanding what are the imminent risks to shipping.
Yeah, well, we're all historians here, so yeah.
Exactly. So you're seeing that at the moment, just from the piracy problems of 2010, 2011, like those kind of times. You're seeing those lessons being used now, the same kind of defensive measures, okay, maybe with some new technology thrown in, are being used like 15 years later.
If you go back a century ago, one of the very first things that happened at the start of the First World War was all those undersea cables got cut. And that was a big focus for the great powers to dominate that. And obviously that's been in the headlines in recent years again. Obviously technology changes things a lot. And we're seeing risks become more complex and layered. Multi-domain would be a phrase to use, but whether it's cyber to infrastructure, a kind of big question to end with, really, to both of you again. What do clients need most from brokers in this environment, as well as from risk advisors, intelligence providers, to try and keep ahead?
Ultimately, insurance is there as a backstop, right? We're there when something goes wrong. And they just want to know that that's the case. And they want to be aware, and they can tell their counterparties that, you know what, if it does all go wrong, the appropriate insurance is in place and that our goods are covered. And we're not going to risk the company because we haven't bought something that's not appropriate. And I think we've got to remember that. And looking forwards, as we get future threats and future problems, we as a specialist provider of risk transfer, we have to remember that.
I mean, there's two I'd just like to highlight before we finish. Our element is reassurance as well, because AnotherDay or the intelligence industry as a whole quite often don't go into companies and completely supersede the existing security infrastructure in these companies. We work alongside CSOs or lead analysts or any of the people working in these teams. As I said earlier, these teams are looking after a global footprint. We can allow ourselves to really focus and hone in on direct individual threats. And then they come to us and say, we're particularly worried about this. And it's just that element of reassurance. And the final thing I'd say is, what do clients now need the most? It's for their security providers or intelligence teams to just be proactive. We were talking about this earlier. It doesn't harm a client to have a number of different scenarios in place at the end of the day. Some may never be used. We saw this in the case of COVID, how many scenarios were put in place for a large scale viral outbreak. Some of these scenarios will never be used, but there is absolutely no harm in having them readily available when a crisis occurs.
It sounds so simple, but 2017, the insurance industry wasn't in its best place. And this was 3 massive weather-related incidents. So there's been a lot of geopolitical talk here, but 3 massive weather-related incidents. And the market turned around and said, we want to see your business continuity plans. We want to see your essentially focused around weather and potentially multiple hurricanes, which is what happened in 2017. And it's those that had those plans in place already, again, they were the ones that recovered quickest and kept their trading going.
That concludes this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, produced in association with Gallagher Specialty. I'd like to thank my 2 great guests for this episode, Alec Russell and Alex File. Thank you to Gallagher Specialty for sponsoring this episode, and thank you for listening, and please do tune in again. I've been your host, David Benyon. Production was by Peter McGill, and Lawrence Durkin made the music.